Alrighty, looks like we're live. Welcome everyone. I'm Sean, this is Moresh. We're the founders of Konkrete, so thanks for joining us today to learn a bit about what we're doing and how we plan to solve the global housing affordability crisis. So what is Konkrete? Let me just get this thing working actually. There we go. So Konkrete exists because us as Australians, if you couldn't tell by our accents, it's because we love our property. You can see here there's $7.4 trillion of property in residential stock alone, which doesn't include office buildings and warehouses and logistics and those kinds of things. But there's a problem. Now it takes the average Australian over 6 years to save for a home deposit in Melbourne and over 8 years in Sydney. It's a very long time for people trying to realize their dream of getting into Australian property. On the flip side, if you own your own house and you're retired and you have no income, it's very hard to access the equity in your property without taking on additional debt. So the solution we came up with is a marketplace to crowdfund your home deposit or release equity from your existing property. And everyday investors who want to invest in property can do so with accessible amounts. So you might be thinking, okay, that sounds like a similar concept to some other things that are in the market. And you're right, there are fractional property platforms out there, but we think they only go so far to solving the underlying problems. For example, certain platforms only present their own properties to the market. And by the time they fractionalize it and present it to the public, they've already made a margin, which means lower returns for the investors. What we propose to do is to create a true marketplace where people can submit their own properties for consideration. Ultimately, people aren't losing sleep because they can't invest in a property with $100. People are losing sleep because they can't, they don't know when they'll be able to afford their house or when they'll be able to, release equity from their properties. So what we propose is a solution that will be accessible to all investors, starting at $100 pops. Investments will be liquid from day one, thanks to the token being freely tradable on exchanges. Investors will be able to experience leverage returns without taking on any debt themselves, which is something many of the other platforms won't be able to provide. And finally, your investments have the opportunity to do good. It'll help a young Australian get into the property ladder much sooner than they would be able to otherwise. So this sounds great, even potentially a little magical, but how do we achieve all of this? One word: blockchain. Now, before I continue, blockchain is a concept that not everyone understands, so I want to give a bit of a primer before we jump into the next stage. So as you can see, what is blockchain? Essentially, it's just a ledger that everyone has a copy of. Let's say I want to give Moresh $10, and I write down in my little ledger that I've sent him $10. But then Moresh writes down that he's only received $5. Who's right? It's my word against his. And then if you multiply that across all the transactions around the world, you have a very cumbersome, inefficient system that ends up costing a lot of money. However, if a transaction happens and it's recorded in a lot of people's ledgers all over the world and it's consistently updated and in real time, there's a single source of truth. And then if someone else says something happened afterwards that isn't the truth, that simply won't be recorded because most people don't have that record in their ledger. Blockchain. Transactions are recorded in the block and then connected into an intellect chain. And the longer the chain, the more sure you can be that that is the single point of truth. Transactions can't be replaced. If I send Moresh something via the blockchain, I can't say, oh, sorry, that was a mistake, and get it to come back. The only way to get that back is then if he does another transaction on that chain back into my account. So why are we using blockchain and why are we excited about it? Firstly, voting and the recording of votes can't be manipulated. We'll have a transparent and immutable record of votes on our system. Cryptocurrencies, which exist on the blockchain, and as you know, many people have them, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a whole bunch of other popular cryptocurrencies out there, they flow freely throughout the blockchain networks around the world. Our tokens will be instantly liquid, which is one of the big advantages of someone using our platform. So to look at something a little like this, where as a Konkrete distributed registry we're building, it'll host a whole bunch of different funds on there, including ones from third-party issuers. So the fractional fund I discussed earlier will be just one of the things that we'll host on the registry that we're building. Nash, do you want to take over and talk about the tokens?
So as Sean mentioned earlier, that we are building the underlying infrastructure on which not just our own fractional property fund, but other people can also issue their own security offerings. So to some extent, we are in the security tokenization space. So what we are doing is building a secondary market a bit similar to the ASX, which is more accessible and a bit more simpler to use and more efficient as well. So the Konkrete tokens are basically like the fuel which power the distributed registry. Now, to give you a simple analogy of what purpose the Konkrete tokens serve, think about the Konkrete tokens as the fuel in a car. So let's say BHP wants to issue their shares on this Konkrete distributed registry. And what BHP will do is they will buy a bunch of Konkrete tokens upfront and they will attach it to their shares. Now, when somebody buys those shares and they want to sell those shares to somebody else, then they will have to pay transaction fees, which are paid in these Konkrete tokens. And as they pay transaction fees, these transaction fees are basically coming out of the reserve which is attached to these tokens, which was prepaid by BHP. So just like you fill fuel in your car tank, BHP has already filled the shares or attached the shares with Konkrete tokens. And as they get traded, these Konkrete tokens get used up. And as they get traded more and more, more of these Konkrete tokens which are attached to these shares get used up. And that basically allows the shares to change hands for a long period of time. Once the Konkrete attached to the share tokens get used up, then BHP can buy another bunch of tokens and they can again start getting liquid over the platform.
Cool. So in terms of the token economics, we'll be only ever generating 100 million of our Konkrete tokens for the life of the project. We can talk about the burning of the tokens, which will present some upward pressure on the value of the tokens over time. And as Maresh mentioned, issuers and fundraisers on the platform will need to prepay in Konkrete tokens in order to make use of the platform. In terms of the further release of tokens, we'll only be doing that if they exceed a predetermined limit, which is something that we outline in the white paper. And this is to ensure that the tokens have long-term utility and that our issuers can continue to use it for their purposes on the Konkrete platform. So how will Konkrete make money?
So just continuing from the analogy which we gave earlier, where the share tokens who are represented by cars and the Konkrete tokens who are representing the fuel, we like to think of the Konkrete distributed registry as a network of highways on which these security tokens can operate. So just like somebody wants to go from point A to B to C to D and vice versa, this basically will be the underlying network or the channels on which these security tokens can exchange hands. Now, the interesting thing is physical roadways have limitations, that is physical limitations in terms of the width and their usability about how many cars can go on it at any given point of time. But the virtual roadways which we are building with Konkrete have no such limitation. In theory, the amount of transactions which can happen over these is pretty much unlimited, subject to, of course, server limitations and the chain transaction volumes. But what we are really building is the virtual gateways on which the security tokens will operate.
So some of the fees that we'll make as a platform will be on the fundraising and on the spread on the secondary market transactions. In terms of the investment into Konkrete, we are doing a fundraise for the development of the platform, the underlying infrastructure, which will support the issue of these tokenized securities. Investors in Konkrete will receive preference shares, of which there will only be 100 million created for their investment. They'll also be given our tokens as a bonus, but they are investing in our shares. The dividends of the company will only flow through those who have preference shares in the business. And as Maresh mentioned earlier, how we intend to generate those dividends is through the transaction fees that we'll be having. Our shares will, of course, also be listed on Konkrete itself, which means that they will then provide investors with liquidity and tradability. So just going back to some use cases, we talked about the fractional fund earlier, and I thought it'd be a good idea just to dive into how that might look in a real world scenario. So take Jimmy, for example, good old Jimmy. He's a 30-year-old working professional. He's got a good wage and he's been pre-approved for a home loan. He's in the market for a house, but he's only saved 10% for a deposit and the banks want 20. So Jimmy's real estate agent or buyer's advocate has a house on the market that he thinks would be great for Jimmy. This real estate agent. He recommends for Jimmy to check out Konkrete as a way to see if they can figure out what they can do about the other 10%. Jimmy loves the concept because he can crowdfund the remaining 10% he needs for his deposit and submits his property for application. So should Jimmy's application be successful, he's able to get into the property ladder right now because it's got 10% rather than having to save up for all of that all over again, by which time property prices have most likely increased again. On the investor side, for those participating in the Konkrete Fractional Fund, they will see Jimmy's proposal come through and be able to vote in a very transparent manner on what they should do. Should the fund invest in Jimmy's house or should it reject it for whatever reason? In this case, they decide that Jimmy has a good record, is able to make his commitments, and the property is in a good area with good growth potential, let's say. The fund wants to give Jimmy the 10% and votes in order to do so. So in exchange, Jimmy will get the money, the remaining 10% that he needs, and the fractional fund will have a stake in his property, which will, of course, reflect in the overall net asset value of the fund, which, of course, will include multiple properties from all over.
So I'll talk about the voting thing over here just a little bit. See, we want to stay true to the blockchain ethos of decentralization, which means that we are not really setting ourselves up to be fund managers. We are leaving the decision of which property gets selected by the fund with the investors in the fund themselves, which means that everybody has the same chance, subject to the quality of their property offerings, to anybody else. And even us as platform operators won't get any special treatment. So the objective behind using voting and voting on the blockchain is to maintain decentralization. And returns which investors get are reflective of the capital gain experienced by the property. And it won't be just one property, it will be a diversified pool of underlying properties, as Sean mentioned.
Absolutely. And because it's built on the Konkrete infrastructure, of course, our investors' investments are tokenized and therefore liquid from day one. And aside from the potential returns and the liquidity, it's important to note as well that they've done some good with that investment. They've helped Jimmy get into the property ladder and helped a young Australian realize their dream of home ownership. Maresh, would you like to talk about some?
So, see, the Konkrete underlying distributed registry is a bit like the ASX, which means that it's not just open to our own fractional property fund, but it can be used by property developers who want to raise money for their development projects. At Estate Baron, we already assist property developers with mechanisms which they can use to raise money for their development projects. But with Konkrete, they will be able to reach a much wider network of investors, global crypto investors. And also, given the fact that their investment offerings are liquid from day one, it means that they will be able to attract investors at a lower cost than usual. And again, it's not just property developers or property-related offers. This whole model can work for any other investment offerings, such as business offerings. Somebody wants to run a restaurant, somebody wants to open a Subway. They can still do an investment offering and have people participate and invest alongside them in their venture.
Absolutely. And, down the line, if somebody comes up with a even better model for a fractional fund that we're able to deliver, we would encourage them and welcome them to put it on the Konkrete platform, because ultimately we are wanting to provide the infrastructure for them to do so rather than be fund managers, as Maurice mentioned.
Yeah, and eventually the objective is to have the best solution come out so that the people who are in the property market and struggling get what they need. And obviously, even if their solution, a competitor solution, is better than ours, we'll still make fees as platform operators.
So a bit of background about us, and in fact, Maurice, you can talk about.
So Estate Baron is an existing property development crowdfunding platform. We have been around for almost 4 years. We have funded property development projects all across Australia. We are open to mom and dad investors. Have raised more than 12 mil, have more than 3,000 investors on the platform. And our property developers have used our assistance to raise more than 40 million for their development projects.
So Collective Campus, the other half of Konkrete, is a corporate accelerator. So we work with some of the big companies that you see here on their corporate innovation strategy and programs. And we also run accelerator programs, having most recently worked with Village Roadshow for VR and AR startups, and of course Charter Hall for Australia's first property tech accelerator program. Here's our network and some of the startups we've incubated over our time. So our job is to basically help startups grow as quickly and as robustly as possible by giving them mentorship, education, expertise, and of course connections to corporates that can help on their journey. In terms of the Konkrete team, we've put together what we think is a really fantastic team of management as well as advisors from all walks of life, from property development to finance to blockchain, and of course other startup founders as well. In terms of our timelines and milestones for the project, coincidentally, both of our initial companies were set up in 2014. In October this year, we'll be doing a crowd sale, a share sale for the Konkrete opportunity. And by mid-2019, we envision that the platform will be live, as well as the fractional fund. Further down the line, based on the fractional fund, we envision a global real estate-backed currency. So how do you get involved? Good question. As alluded to earlier, we're doing a share sale, so we won't be doing an ICO, but rather an ISO, because people will be buying preference shares in the company as part of their investment. We'll be giving Konkrete tokens as a bonus and raising 13 million overall as part of our fundraise, 3 mil of which is open right now to wholesale investors.
Wholesale and private investors, sophisticated investors.
Yeah, so if you are one of those, you can request the IM by reaching out to us on our website and email. And for everyone else, you can register your interest in Konkrete at konkrete.io. And as a bit of a bonus, we're giving the first 100 people to complete their account registration with us with free KKT tokens, 20 of them, in fact. Yeah. You can also join the community by talking to us at konkrete.slack.com, which is our Slack community. And we welcome anyone to come on board and join us there and talk to them about what they see is important in the tokenization of assets.
Yep.
So the crowd sale, as mentioned earlier, will be open in October, and you can express interests now through that website. I think that's it in terms of the presentation.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for coming.
Cheers.
Cheers.
How many minutes?